Hello everyone. For some reason the traffic seems really loud to me today. I don't really know why, but hopefully I'll be able to accommodate whatever noise it makes somewhat in the editing process. If it is disruptive, I do apologize. As you can see, I've rearranged my room a little bit, so I'm kind of in a new spot to sit and film, and that feels very odd to me. It's like, hello. Good morning. Anyway, so as we come into the lead up to Imbolc this year, which is obviously a point on the quote wheel of the year that I do celebrate, I wanted to kind of talk through some of my ideas and preparations that I'm kind of gearing up for, both in terms of Imbolc itself, but then also in terms of the time of year and some of the things I'm working on. And I wanted then to bring that into a discussion specifically for Imbolc around craft, and more specifically than that, sewing, glamour magic, stitchcraft, thriftcraft, I suppose, effectively enclothed cognition, all those sorts of things that do make a fairly regular appearance on my channel. So I have obviously made a video about glamour magic before, sort of introducing some of my perspective on the topic and so on, and this video is going to be sort of expanding on that and augmenting that a bit, just sort of exploring the topic a bit more conversationally, and covering a little bit different ground obviously than that video did. So first off, I wanted to kind of discuss Imbolc and some of my plans for Imbolc this year. Usually around Imbolc I get very I suppose I'm always very craft and art oriented, but I sort of amp that up a bit around Imbolc. Arguably I do that for any of the main fire festivals, but more specifically around Imbolc I tend to focus on things that are, I suppose you could call domestic crafts. So rather than an overly large association with things like high art, I get a bit more folkloric and a bit more, I suppose, rooted in the craft activities with which I engage, So for example, this year, some of the things I'm kind of hoping to focus on are cleaning the house a bit, and possibly involving some of my favorite folkloric motifs or mythological motifs in that activity, but very much bringing with it that time of year, clearing out, cleaning out, preparing for the onset of spring kind of mentality. But I'm also going to be focusing this year more specifically on getting some of my base clothing layers established for the oncoming warmer months, as well as mending some of my clothing. So the association there for me is around, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit further in a bit, but is around associations with the Cailleach and with Brigid. Again, I've said in the past, I do not worship Brigid as a deity. Cailleach a little bit, potentially. It depends on how you define deity versus archetype versus folkloric motif, and whether or not you even see these figures in like the most hard polytheist way possible versus not. But the point being that it's a very sort of potent dichotomy that kind of gets very much talked about around this time for Imbolc, with the opposite sort of switch over between the two happening at the time of Lunasa. So I always find, especially with this sort of burgeoning awareness of the blossoming to come and so on that we get with a lot of Imbolc style imagery around Cailleach versus Brigid, there's this interesting sort of tension for me on some of the textile associations that I tend to have with this time of year. So this year, I don't know if any of that made any sense, but this year what that means is focusing on those base layers. As I've said many times on this channel, summer in particular, but also spring, any warm weather is very, very difficult for me. It's gotten easier in recent years since I've started more overtly managing my clothing, and what I hope to do this year is focus a lot more on basic underlayers, practical underlayers that wick away sweat, that keep the body clean and dry, but also cool, that are not overly insulating. So from a historical perspective, that's a lot of linen. For me, I'll mention this in a bit, but it'll be a mix of things like linen to the extent that I can afford it, especially for something that's unseen, the underneath layers, and other forms of somewhat more modern, modernly accessible fabrics that are like, you know, similarly soothing for the skin and a bit more durable. So things like bed sheets. And in this case, a lot of white layers, since that's kind of the easiest to launder. Again, a lot of this being informed by historical stuff. So between that and mending things like my socks, and I have some of my partner's clothing that needs mending, and to be honest, also some of his clothing to break up for scrap fabric, for cleaning fabrics and things like that. He's got an old pair of corduroys that is just beyond repair at this stage. They're so old. So I'm going to be breaking that up into squares of fabric for the purpose of using for like really dirty cleaning projects and things like that. Those are some of my plans around Imbolc as relates to fabric, sewing, reuse of materials, and so on. I am also going to be doing things that to other people would look more overtly magical and witchy. I have, I don't know if you can see on my altar behind me, but I have candles to replace, which I'm mulling over color specific candles, although I do tend to prefer my magic red. And some very, very basic forms of kitchen witchery and acknowledgement of some of the food associations with the time of year. So yeah, those are some of my Imbolc plans. I'm going to be focusing on some of the prep for that this weekend so that I don't place all the pressure on the exact time itself, something I often do and end up regretting about the fire festivals, is I just overload myself all on the one day, as it were. Okay, so on to the topic, therefore, of Glamour Magick and some of the ways in which I approach that. The aim of discussing all of this really isn't so much to be like, ooh, look at all these things that I do very specifically relevant to my life and only me, 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 me. It's more for the purpose to discuss some of the ways that I apply some of the ideas that I've come across, offer up some ideas as well, and insofar as something seems relevant, interesting to you, doable, not doable, hopefully that this then provides effectively food for thought. Actually, you know, for that matter, if you have any of your own ideas around some of the things that I mentioned, or things that you do at this time of year, or things you do with like clothing and fabric or vintage thrifted things and so on in general, get a conversation going down in the comments, because I think this is the sort of thing that is actually like be more important to a lot of people. It's really, really fun. It's really interesting. It's an opportunity for creativity, all that stuff. So there's a lot of background stuff for me around how I approach all of this. Fight fast fashion and slow fashion movement being a huge component of it. It's really important to me in general, as I think is clear on my channel, to understand why I want to engage with a given thing. That doesn't mean that my knowledge on anything is exhaustive or even particularly well developed. It's more that when I'm curious about something, I like to try to follow that through, and I like to have things interlock so that I can remember what I've learned and remember why I apply things the way I apply things. So, clothing pun intended, it all kind of relates back to the ways in which I layer concepts on top of each other. So a first example that I have here is my sewing machine, Brigid. I will put as a cutaway footage of her as I discuss her. I named this sewing machine Brigid after this time of year. As I've said briefly in another video, she arrived to me in the post after I ordered her on Imbolc, the year she came, and I have very distinct ways in which I relate her to that time of year and also to that name. So again, I've mentioned briefly that she is named Brigid partly in homage to Brigid Cleary, who is the last person to have been burned as a changeling in Ireland, not a witch, a changeling. I personally have a lot of emotional connection and sort of imbued personal significance in the motif of the changeling for reasons I'll perhaps get into another time. But also the overall tragedy of that story, the role that it's possible her sewing machine played in the events that transpired, and the reception of her as a person before her death, as well as after her death, and so on, and the impact on her community, the impact more broadly on our understanding of the folkloric in Ireland, and so on and so forth, the political ambiance of the day. All of that really says a lot to me about, gives me a lot of ideas, but also is very intensely emotional and potent, and it's something that I wish never to lose my awareness of. That event happened, if I'm remembering correctly, in 1895, which is actually after this sewing machine was produced and made. So, as again, I think I've said, the bobbin winder attachment on this machine is specific to a make that I believe came out of the Singer production location in Scotland. I don't have the attachment that goes with it, but as you can see, I've kind of used a mixture of fabric and twine to make it workable, so I am capable of winding my bobbin. She is a hand crank 12K new model, new family model, the first, effectively the first domestic model of sewing machine that was ever produced by the Singer Company, which was the first company to produce this type of sewing machine rather than, say, I think it's chain stitch machines came first, but this is the first, what's it called, lock stitch machine that was ever produced for domestic use. This is called a fiddle base machine, which also for me is really pertinent because I'm a violinist and have grown up being a violinist and have performed as a violinist. So I really enjoy making sure that most of the things I do have like a secret musical component at all times. It's almost like I'm singing to myself through the act of sewing and crafting. A continuation of the music that surrounds, if we want to get really sort of metaphorical about it. This machine in particular, which you can tell from the serial numbers on the side here, was produced in 1888. She has all of the component parts that she needs to be operational. The one thing that's known to be really, really tricky about these early models is that the needle on these machines is no longer produced, and there are almost no modern companies that produce anything resembling the type of needle required for this machine. Very specifically, she is a round shank needle is the type of needle she requires. The length of the needle at the time of the production of this machine was not fully standardized, and the model that came directly after her started up using a different needle length in general. So it's really, really tricky from machine to machine to find what needle would work, even if you have the right kind of shank shape. What I ended up doing here is I finally, after lots of checking different spreadsheets available online, measurements, people's solutions that did or did not work for them, etc., I finally found a company that produces round shank needles of the right diameter for industrial machines. Since this machine was the first domestic, it was very similar still to a lot of industrial machine techniques for manufacture. So I found an industrial needle of the right diameter, round shank, and ordered some of those to see if they would work. The difficulty with the ones that I have are that they are too long specifically for my machine. So I actually filed down the top of the shaft of the needle to shorten the overall length of the needle, and then was finally able to mount it into this machine. So again, there's a lot of work that goes into sort of understanding what an older machine like this would need, but ultimately it's actually extraordinarily easy to use, and it's really, really durable. This thing can stitch through leather if I wanted to. And I just find it really, really rewarding and also amazing to use because, of course, that sewing machine sound is just to die for. And I find that it makes it really, really easy for me to conceive of what I need to machine stitch versus hand stitch. I like that I also personally am not using electricity in any of my sewing activities, and that it slows down my progress, or rather my consumption of fabrics and so on. It makes me think through my clothing projects in particular in a way that suits me and my neurology. And expense-wise, she's really not more expensive than your average sort of more affordable range of machines, and that was another reason I personally definitely wanted to acquire a working antique. Obviously, no one has to have an antique, it's just me getting super nerdy about it. So that's some of the basics around Brigid. For the purposes of today's video, I wanted to break down my discussion of Glamour Magick into 3 loose categories of things to mention ideas, concepts, techniques, that kind of thing. The first category is this idea of illusion, optical illusion, and what that does or does not mean about your actual body and your embodiment as a person. So one of the things that I actually focus on quite a lot, especially because I like to wear a lot of black, is this concept of silhouette. I personally prefer a corseted silhouette, but this is where the illusion comes into play because the appearance of being corseted is not the same as being really intensely compressed or tight-laced. A lot of that depends on what your actual body is, needs, where, not just in terms of your actual measurements, but also where you are the most three-dimensional, as it were. So again, this can be a little bit surprising. A lot of the width, in terms of if I were to measure around my rib cage, say, to get my bust measurement, a lot of the larger width of that measurement is actually contained behind me. My back is quite wide. My shoulders are quite broad, but also very distinctly, the back half of any top that I wear takes up, with the exception of the actual bust itself, more fabric than the front of my tops. So I'm very, very large and broad looking in the back. Interestingly enough, though, the smallest part of my waist is also behind me at the very crux of the inward part of my waist. The actual waistline towards the back is where the waist actually saves the most shape. So knowing these sorts of things about your own three-dimensionality allows you to work with effectively the raw material that is you, that is your body, and to experiment with what silhouettes feel comfortable, what silhouettes seem the most natural on you, whether or not that's something you want to explore further yourself, and so on and so forth. One of the things that I realized really quickly in exploring this stuff sort of gradually over time, but like once I really wanted to wear a corset on the regular, there was one thing I knew straight off, is that from a natural visuals perspective, my actual body type is the closest to a very, very Edwardian figure, late Victorian, early Edwardian figure. So I knew, first of all, from reference paintings, which paintings I most resembled in terms of body size, type, shape, all that kind of thing. I also knew that that was most likely, that kind of stuff was most likely to feel the most comfortable on my body. And I also knew that a lot of those things were hearkening back to a lot of medieval silhouettes, which meant that the interplay between parts of the 19th century and the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance were likely to be something that I would be able to do with a fair amount of success and with a fair amount of consistency. So as my base layer, for example, I wear an Edwardian long line corset. It is not a corset that it's easy to tight lace with. In fact, it would be very, very difficult. It's not the most structured of corsets. I personally really enjoy a sense of sensory pressure on the skin. I have a lot of problems with spinal injuries and really, really hypermobile joints, so I also find that it functions as a bit of a back brace. But in terms of silhouette, it also allows me to highlight the fact that my proportions are very distinctly Victorian. There is this sense of there having been a Victorian ideal set of proportions, which people were free to lace down to, but they were also free to pad outward to. If you don't, basically with Victorian proportions, you don't have to actually lace down at all if you don't wish to. And the idea being that regardless of your exact size as a person, you could still create the silhouette you wanted. Usually, therefore, being the silhouette that was in fashion. There's a lot of like social commentary around these things as well that is important, but I will probably have to address that some other time. But for example, there is this sense at various points along the historical trajectory in the 19th century that the ideal sort of quote-unquote Victorian silhouette would have been taking the waist measurement and the bust being 10 inches wider than the waist measurement, and the hips being 15 inches wider than the waist measurement. So you have a bust, you subtract 10 inches, you get the waist, and then you add 15 inches and you get the hips. It just so happens that is exactly what my natural measurements are. My natural waist, with or without a corset actually, is 36 inches, 36.5 on a slightly more swollen kind of day. And correspondingly, my bust is about circa 46 inches. My hips are 51 inches in circumference. I'm not a small person. So within modern society, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was growing up, that made no sense to have measurements. Again, I was a smaller person then, but the proportions were very similar. It made no sense for me to be shaped like that. And what I like to do with silhouette is to create context for my shape. So we have this notion of learning what your body is and then exercising agency over that. It is one of your tools. It is one of your raw materials. It is one of the mediums with which you paint your life. I will also be able to show that all of this sort of stuff is a learning process. So very specifically, the corset that I wear on a day-to-day basis is actually a little bit short-waisted for me. I'm a very tall person, but most of my height is taken up by my torso. My legs are actually really short for my height. What I do in order to feel more comfortable and more stylistically pleased is I enjoy a lot of long skirts to kind of emphasize where my natural waist is. However, my current corset is a little bit too short-waisted for me, so I will show in footage a place in my corset where I can actually push it in so that you can see where my actual waist is. And what's so interesting about that is it also indicates just how much space that is free inside my corset. That still does not apply too much pressure at any one given pressure point. All of which you would not be able to tell just by looking at me because, of course, I'm this hourglass shape robed in black, and the way the brain understands that information is as a solid silhouette. The next thing that I wanted to discuss is the use of resources. So again, this is the sort of thing that I like to engage with around this time of year in particular, because there's a real emphasis on the layers that are not going to be seen for me, especially this year. So for example, we have the idea of thrifting clothing, modern clothing, you know, stuff from the 80s, stuff from the 90s, so on and so forth, which is incidentally more likely to be better made because the plastic content in all the fibers is comparatively low. Much more likely to be comfortable on the skin, at least for me. There's an element of financial thrift, but there's also an element of resource thrift in terms of material goods, time spent, and also a thrift, like an emotional thriftiness, as it were. I find that to wear clothing that doesn't feel good, doesn't fit, is a style that doesn't feel like me, wastes a lot of my emotional energy very, very quickly. If we talk about things that like, almost like energy vampires, things that you would put on you that leech your sense of self out of you, clothing is something that has a lot of power over the body to do that. And there's a lot of ways in which one can curate one's clothing and then also, as I will discuss in a bit, imbue power and intention and significance and potency into it. So thrift is one way that I really enjoy doing that. I've shown footage of me thrifting in various places in recent videos. A lot of my clothing is made out of inexpensive fabrics. So the strength card dress that I made is in fact a poly cotton, but it's a dead stock poly cotton, so it was not new bought. It was leftover in warehouses, not going to be used, ready for landfill. And you can go and buy up dead stock fabric at drastically reduced prices. You can literally get, you know, fashion house suiting wool if you want for much more affordable prices, because they're never going to use the end of the bolt. They don't have enough to make it viable for them. And you are making sure that less of that waste material goes into landfill in a manner that looks really good, looks as if if this is something you care about, looks as if you bought something really, really high-end and fancy, but instead you bought the material at a low cost and then made it for yourself and saved an excess of waste. I use a lot of bed sheets that I get in thrift shops and things like that. So I have here, I showed these pillowcases, for example, in my last video. And I actually made a tarot bag finally using this embroidered fabric from the pillowcases. I'm wearing a petticoat right now that is also made from one of those bed sheets that I showed in that last video that I finished making just the other day, and footage of that will be included in this video. I also, the purple skirt that I wear in some of my videos, the large Victorian purple skirt, is a bed sheet. It's a thrifted bed sheet, all one base solid color. As soon as I saw that gorgeous royal purple, I was like, that is begging to be mine, and I will be making clothing out of that. And that pattern that I used also for that skirt is free, available online. For those of you who are already history bounders, you will recognize when I say that it is the Keystone Jacket and Dress Cutter from 1895 pattern for the walking skirt. And it's fully lined on the inside by that same black deadstock poly cotton that I am wearing in my strength dress right now as the underlayer. Other materials you can use for clothing are curtains. I know that there's the whole, like, you know, Sound of Music kind of thing, but the point being you get to choose your own patterns and not maybe being a little too obvious about it if you don't want to be. Although I'm sure there's curtain core out there somewhere. You can use tablecloth. And then, as I indicated earlier, you can also, once clothing is beyond repair, break it up and sew it into rags to use for cleaning projects and so on. So basically using this historical motif of getting the absolute most of what you have already in a way that makes it really fun and active to do so. Another example of this kind of use of resources is that the fashion layer of fabric, the fashion fabric on my corset, which is made out of a coutil as the base layer, the strength layer. The fashion layer is fabric that you will have seen around this room in other contexts. So for example, this bag that I have here that I made that houses my newly modded medieval scapini is the same fabric with which I made my corset. And that's another thing also, is knowing that the strength, like, you know, this thing that you associate with the internal strength, which I also, again, red is a very important color for me. So in terms of witchcraft, it is important to me that some of my underlayers that provide me with this sense of like locked in armor, flexibility, but protection, not that it would protect you from anything, but it creates that sensation of being somewhat more invincible. The way in which I have control over my own silhouette has that red color, has that magical potency, and that I then see it reproduced elsewhere around me, in my tarot decks, in my art projects, and so on, so that I'm reinforcing those magical associations as I work, while also being quite thrifty about my use of fabric. So moving on from that, therefore, I also want to talk about ideas and techniques that one could try. And this is all stuff that I'm very much still experimenting with on the regular. Again, if one doesn't want to sew specifically, one can thrift, buy secondhand. You can buy a huge jumper and then cut off the bottom. You can experiment with draping things. You can do this with jewelry as well. You can decide when you thrift that you want a specific color, so whenever you see that color, you collect patches of fabric and then you stick it all together and make yourself this amazing Technicolor thing. The possibilities around this. And the same goes for things like mending. If you need to mend something, if you need to patch something, if you need to darn something, fix a hole, strengthen a weak spot in your clothes, you can imagine that all of this has a lot of potential for magical associations and magical opportunities to work magic. Things like protection magic, sense of self, what you want to project to others, both in terms of enclothed cognition, in terms of how you perceive yourself and therefore move through the world, but also the impression you want to give others about yourself. Have a little bit more control over your persona. I personally wouldn't want to lie about my identity, my persona, and so on, but I do really benefit from augmenting aspects of, say, my artistic persona, so that I can move and speak and talk with authenticity, but in a way that actually is presentable to others and not completely garbled, for example. So my clothing helps me do that. It helps me retain a sense of self, which is something I have actually talked about in another video, which I'll link in the cards as well as in the description bar. So you also have this idea of, therefore, like, again, a lot of these techniques that I am going to talk about do involve things like sewing and so forth, but the point that it is that you can extrapolate it further to understand that sewing itself is not necessarily required. It can be all about how you combine pieces, how you layer things, what colors you choose, what time periods you choose, what vintage or whatever else you choose. So we have this notion, for example, of the seen versus the unseen, and this can apply in like a couple of different ways. One being that if the underlayers are something that you don't want to be as meticulous about in your sewing, you can be more aware of where you want to focus your energy. So your underlayers could be less neatly stitched, for example. And you could then, again, because no one's going to see it, you then make sure that you direct your attention to where you want it to matter most, and that's where your attention to detail goes. Conversely, there's also things you can do with your underlayers that literally no one will see that you know is the case. So for example, the red color of my corset is an example. You might be able to stitch in or dye in certain colors or certain personal symbols, sigils, things like that. You could hide, you can make a little pocket to put certain herbs in and carry a certain smell around you. You can hide little notes inside certain things if you want to carry a sigil on a specific day and then take it out before wash and destroy it or whatever else. You can do all sorts of things like that. Historically, people would have thought in these terms effectively as well. We have in, I think it's the late Middle Ages, certainly early Renaissance and into the, I believe, the 17th century. We have this notion that the underlayers, petticoats and things like that needed to be red because it was a warming color. And we're talking about, you know, very cold weather at the time in most of Europe. So you have, if you take that and you extrapolate, you could say, well, I want my underlayers always to be this or that color, or to always have this or that thing, and that the presence of that component enacts protection, enacts strength, enacts a fiery character in me, or cools me down and makes me more of a flowing, watery sort of person, when what I want to evoke more of is that element of water in the proceedings of my day-to-day, etc. So there's all sorts of things that, you know, where you might want to consider what's seen versus what is unseen, and how does that impact my sense of magic and stitchcraft and glamour magic and enclothed cognition and so on. Therefore, similarly, you have, so I've said the colors of your layers, but also thread color. I have specific thread colors that I will use for specific purposes, whether they match the fabric or not in certain circumstances. I also, when I use lining fabrics, will often juxtapose my lining fabric against the actual color of the fabric that I'm using, especially since very frequently that's black. Some of the strength layers underneath my clothing, so for some of my kirtles, I have a reinforcing strip of linen or other such strong fabric where the lacing holes are. And I will pick specific colors for that. And sometimes I'll layer on the outside a color that matches the lining layer on the inside, but nobody else necessarily knows that. And then I don't necessarily always use colors that match in terms of the thread. It depends on what I want to be visible and what I don't, and what magical intention I'm working into the use of that color of thread. Let's see. Another component, again, is around structuring silhouette. You can use padding, and you can use the way, you know, in the same way that the 80s kind of bulked up the shoulders to imply a smaller waist, the way in which you use padding might also benefit from what you use as padding stuffing material. One thing I definitely do in order to make better use of the resources to hand is when I need to stuff, say, some of my poppets, for example, is the most frequent way in which I end up using this. I take what is often referred to in the sewing world as cabbage, which is like your scrap fabric, but the tiniest pieces that are just no good to be using for any clothing because they're too small, they're cut down too small. I'll take that and I will cut it up really, really tiny. Takes ages and it definitely makes your hands really tired, but it's effectively shredding your fabric almost. And I will use that as stuffing material along with things like herbs and quite frequently my hair, because I cut my own hair and all that kind of thing. So that often goes into my own personal puppets, but it's something that you could also work into some of your own clothes. Or, you know, again, if you're hiding a spell bag in your clothing, having that be a part of how you conceive of a spell bag might be really interesting. And again, if materials are safe and biodegradable, you could find ways that, so long as you check what you're doing, you could find ways to safely dispose of that outside if that's something that you care about with the use of your spell materials. Two last things that I will mention also because I'm running out of camera battery, is one thing I do a lot of, as I mentioned earlier with music, is I combine disciplines in a single activity. So one of the things that I do quite frequently is sing to myself, like all the time. It's a stim as far as I'm concerned as well. But when I'm sewing, I will very frequently use a lot of folk songs or themes or folk motifs in my singing to reinforce that sense of power. I will also speak to my clothes. Again, I've referred to the repetitious nature of stitching. I will use things like rocking, affirmations, statements of power, words of power, songs of power, as I'm sewing, as I'm crafting something, as I'm taking in a modern piece, whatever it happens to be. And that builds energy, the rhythmic nature of it it's almost like it recurringly makes a magical gesture and directs your intention into the piece that you're working on. Whether it's a longer project or a shorter project doesn't really matter. So some types of songs that I tend to choose are things around social context and the concept of rebellion. Rebellion songs can be really interesting to think about. Death motifs are rife in most folk material. I do tend to focus on American, Irish, and Scottish trad for the most part for these purposes. But any song, medieval, modern, whatever, 19th century, etc., any time period that refers to fine Holland is referring to a Holland shroud for death. And again, for me, especially as a death-positive individual, I have a tendency to use that as part of the way in which I will do shadow work, or I might want to combat the social pressures around fear of death and so on, and I will work that into my clothing. I will sing to myself about that when I'm working that into my clothing. You know, there's also all sorts of stuff around work and labor songs. You know, we have the, I think recently more popularized awareness of Scottish walking songs, W-A-U-L-K, songs that were used for shrinking the tweed. There's travel songs, travel motifs, pilgrimage songs. Let's see, what other things do I have here as examples. I also tend to really like using nonsense songs or counting songs, or joke songs about the devil, especially when it refers to things like shoes or clothing. There's a lot of American song motifs that sing about vanquishing the devil using your steel-toed boots, for example. Or again, if you're again, you could do this for any type of discipline. So there's loads of stuff around kitchen witchery, where you literally use cooking songs about defeating the devil to kind of make a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that you're a witch. But I do that with my clothing as well. I'll also often listen to the same material, so I'm not necessarily always singing, although I'll also listen to the material and then sing harmony parts because that's just something I like to do. So you can kind of see that there's a lot of different things you can do with this. I mean, even just off the top of my head, another thing you could do is if you're sitting in a rocking chair or even just rocking yourself, you can evoke horror motifs as you're sitting and singing and just being really weird and creepy about it, or as you're sewing the look of a favorite movie character that you like to have sort of associated with you from day to day. Sorsha from Willow. You might choose your colors and then sew and create identity around this visual, and then make sure that when you're singing, you might like to sing fantasy songs or something like that from favorite movies or whatever else. And then that in turn reinforces that as a reality inbuilt into your life, for example. So again, and that's to say nothing of the ways in which, you know, art historical references might work, and the stuff that you kind of cobble together and make into your clothes. And then on top of that, for me, since I really like to be quite thrifty about the actual fabric that I wear and how old it is, whether I mend it, I don't purchase from modern fast fashion at all anymore, which in fairness is really expensive to do anyway. It's like prohibitively expensive for me. So what I end up doing as well is that allows me to then focus in other areas. As I said, I don't tend to splash out a huge amount, but there are occasionally things where it's like, okay, well, if I've saved X amount of money, I might be able to save enough to get this type of piece of jewelry that I've wanted for a long time, or this type of tarot deck, or this thing from this other, completely other part of my life, Glamour Magick related or not. And that's Glamour Magick helping you in other parts, very pentacles-y, helping you in other parts of your life, or giving you clearer intentions about other parts of your life in a way that doesn't feel punishing. It feels fun. At least it does for me. So after that huge ramble, I hope any of that made sense to anybody. I hope it wasn't too boring or too random effectively. Again, any ideas, comments, personal craft projects that you like to engage in, leave in the discussion box below. Again, there's no possibility that I could ever address like all of the things that I like to think about with this in one video. Yeah, I'm just gonna stop talking now and hope that that was useful in some capacity, if not, then at least entertaining. I hope everyone is doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and being kind. And I will see you all next time. Bye.